The grandiose ideal of Russia's imperial restoration met its definitive end not on the kinetic front lines of Ukraine, but amidst the dense forests of the Leningrad Oblast. In a significant security breach just days ago, 9 prisoners, who had been mobilized for deployment to the Ukrainian theater, neutralized their guards and vanished into the taiga. This incident cannot be dismissed as a simple tactical evasion. It serves as a strategic announcement to the world that Russia's penitentiary system, currently the Kremlin's single largest reservoir for military force generation, is on the precipice of systemic combustion. The calculus is stark, even for a convict. The uncertainty of fleeing into the wilderness is safer than the certainty of combat under Vladimir Putin's command. Analyze the optics of the footage closely. The man seated across from President Putin is the director of the Federal Penitentiary Service. One must ask, why would the most powerful autocrat of a nuclear superpower find it necessary to hold a televised summit with a prison bureaucrat? The answer lies in a grim reality. The nation's primary logistics hub for military manpower has shifted from recruitment centers to penal colonies. And this critical supply line is now spiraling out of control. The message Putin intended to project with this bureaucratic theater was one of stability, that everything is under control. Instead, reality struck back with a horrific insurrection bubbling up from the very bedrock of the state apparatus. This prison break has triggered a cascading failure in personnel replenishment, precipitating a shortage of combat-capable soldiers. Consequently, the Russian armed forces have descended into a state of unimaginable desperation to mitigate this manpower crisis. We are now witnessing the mobilization of the illiterate and the cognitively impaired to the zero line. This transcends a mere logistical fiasco. It represents the embryonic stage of a civil conflict for the regime itself. The prevailing myth of Russia's inexhaustible human resources has been effectively wiped out. A wave of dissent is now rippling from the trenches all the way back to the streets of St. Petersburg. Consider the visual evidence. The woman in the frame is Lyudmila Vassilieva, 83 years of age, born on the 22nd of April 1941. During the harrowing siege of Leningrad, she has spent her entire existence in St. Petersburg. By all historical metrics, she should be the sacred matriarch of Putin's narrative of patriotism, a figure whom the state should eulogize as a hero on national television. Instead, what transpired? Lyudmila Vassilieva took to Palace Square, holding a solitary anti-war placard. The police force detained this 83-year-old survivor. The Kremlin was forced to arrest its own living history to maintain silence. This incident represents a catastrophic failure for the Kremlin's narrative control. When a figure who survived the siege and served the defense industry declares that Putin's war is an act of treason, it fundamentally undermines the ideological front, the very bastion that should be the regime's strongest fortification. This nightmare, in which Vladimir Putin has ensnared his own populace, is now dragging the entire federation into chaos. Russian military doctrine has devolved into a strategy of feeding the meat grinder, predicated on the willingness to absorb hundreds of thousands of casualties. However, this ruthless operational model has mutated into a mechanism of self-destruction. At the epicenter of this collapse lies the shift to coercive conscription, implemented after voluntary recruitment effectively halted. With monthly enlistment quotas plummeting into the low hundreds, and with signing bonuses and salaries being slashed, the Kremlin has turned to its darkest reserves to fuel the war effort. Since 2022, open-source intelligence estimates that between 140,000 and 180,000 convicts have been released to fight. Yet, the illusion that this source was infinite was shattered by the shocking incident in the Leningrad region. 9 convicts liquidated their escorts during transfer to Ukraine and fled into the woods. A prisoner faced a tripartite dilemma, where each path was marked by death, terror, and despair. The first trajectory, remain incarcerated, rotting behind concrete walls for 10 to 15 years, but retaining a statistical probability of survival. It meant enduring cold, hunger, and oppression. Yet compared to the kinetic front, it was the lowest risk option. The second trajectory, deployment to the kill zone, Being herded by Wagner or the regular army through the corridors of death, stretching from Bakhmut to Avdiivka, meant almost certain liquidation, either by enemy fire or by the blocking detachments of one's own side. The third trajectory was escape, necessitating, if required, the elimination of the Guard. It was a high-risk gamble, but it represented the sole vector to freedom and survival. It was also the harshest and most desperate form of rebellion against the system. The prisoner's calculation that killing a guard was a superior option to entering the military death machine demonstrates that the prison system has ceased to be a reliable resource for soldiers and has instead become a present source of internal instability. The regime's authority has evaporated, even behind its most secure walls. This deterioration has not escaped Vladimir Putin's notice. As analysts at Nexta TV observe, it is no coincidence that Putin met with the head of the Federal Penitentiary Service to report that more than 90% of prisoners are now working. Of course, in this context, work is a euphemism for deployment to the front lines in Storm Z assault units. When the pool of volunteers and mercenaries dried up, Russian authorities were forced to shift tactics to forced mobilization. A 19-year-old recently captured in Ukraine revealed to interrogators that, with little time remaining on his sentence, Russian investigators suddenly fabricated new charges against him. Faced with the threat of years of additional imprisonment, he was coerced into signing a military contract. Ukrainian intelligence services report that more than 100 such forcibly imposed sentences were executed in the first half of 2025 alone. Prisoners are presented with a binary choice: sign or rot, often while facing trumped-up charges and restricted to inhumane conditions like 3 liters of water per week. This systemic cruelty represents the heaviest pressure a state can exert upon its own citizenry. This situation exposes just how desperate Putin has become, forcing him to resort to inhumane methodologies against his own people. The oppression exercised by Russian military recruiters has now become a source of internal instability, not only on the kinetic front lines but even in the most remote and vulnerable peripheries of the country. The collapse of a regime is rarely measured solely by economic indicators or casualty counts on the battlefield. The ultimate collapse is the disintegration of the narrative, the loss of its moral foundation. Russia's manpower crisis is not limited to forced recruitment from prisons. It has metastasized into a moral collapse and an inhumane logistical fiasco. This section serves as the most painful and stark proof of the negligible value Putin places on human life. Investigative research by The Telegraph has revealed that Russia has begun deploying physically and mentally disabled soldiers to the front lines. Take the case of Semyon Karmanov, a 27-year-old man who was illiterate and had been diagnosed with significant behavioral disorders since childhood. The Prison Medical Commission classified him as Category A, fully fit for military service. He was issued a military driver's license, despite his mother's testimony that he lacked the cognitive ability to operate a vehicle. Shortly after deployment, he was shot in the head and killed in action. Then there is Alexei Vakrushchev, a 22-year-old who had spent the majority of his life under psychiatric care. Despite being deemed medically unfit for service, he was forcibly coerced by police into signing a military contract. Similarly, Volkov Oleg Vladimirovich, diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder as a child, was forced to sign a contract after being detained for theft. A Ukrainian military expert states that this situation is systematic due to the critical need for manpower. Russia is forced to recruit citizens regardless of their health or physical disabilities. Sending these individuals to the front is not only an ethical disaster, it is military suicide. These individuals cannot be trained or integrated into combat cohesion units. They are treated as expendable assets, cannon fodder, used simply to deplete Ukrainian ammunition stocks. Colonel Alexander Zavtunov characterizes this as a cannibalistic tactic. To the civilized world, this appears as barbarism. But for the Russian command, it has become a normalized method of waging war, devoid of any regard for human life. This picture reveals not only the magnitude of personnel losses, but also the deep logistical collapse of the Russian armed forces. Russia's casualty ratio on the battlefield stands at approximately 1:1, that is, for every 10 wounded soldiers, only 7 to 8 are saved, while a staggering 4 to 5 lose their lives. This is extremely abnormal by modern warfare standards. In advanced NATO armies, this ratio results in a high number of wounded survivors and a low number of fatalities due to effective medical evacuation. When the medical system functions with speed and efficacy, wounded soldiers survive. Losses are minimized. So why is this ratio so deadly in the Russian army? The reason lies in 3 fundamental logistical and structural inadequacies: the rotary wing aviation assets, armored ambulances, and organized evacuation chains needed to transport wounded soldiers from the zero line to safe rear areas are almost never operational. Many soldiers are left waiting for hours on the cold ground, slowly bleeding to death. Often, the only thing they are waiting for is the end. The lack of field hospitals, mobile surgical teams, or first aid supplies prevents even the simplest interventions. Basic life-saving procedures, such as hemorrhage control, tourniquet application, or shock management, simply cannot be performed. The most frightening reality is this: the Russian military establishment is not even willing to rectify these deficiencies. Instead of establishing a robust evacuation system, providing medical support, and investing in human capital, the Kremlin views replacing the dead with fresh recruits as more economically viable. The majority of the fallen could have been saved with simple interventions during the golden hour, but in Russia, the value of human life is low. Within the army, it is virtually zero. The scale of losses on the front lines is no longer an abstract statistic. Physical evidence of this disaster is emerging across the Russian landscape. The offensive on Pokrovsk has become a symbol, not of victory, but of a relentless death machine. Russia lost 25,000 soldiers in October alone, based solely on confirmed visual evidence. The actual figure is estimated to be as high as 28,000. This translates to an average of 35 soldiers lost every hour for the control of a minor tactical objective. This means sacrificing more than half a person per minute in a war devoid of strategic logic. The logistical and tactical blindness behind these losses confirms that Putin's command structure is fundamentally rotten. The confession of a Russian soldier fighting in Chasiv Yar, who stated that his unit had lost over 90% of its strength, is shocking. They recruit individuals with zero capability, spending millions to mobilize them, only for them to arrive and die immediately. This is a cycle of waste. Millions of rubles spent on training, signing bonuses, and salaries are directly converted into military waste when these soldiers are liquidated upon arrival. This is proof of how the limited resources Putin spends to fuel his war economy are squandered due to the incompetence and ruthlessness of his own commanders. Moreover, this error is recursive. One unit is destroyed, and another follows the exact same path, into the same trap system, with the same stupidity. Worst of all, commanders fail to learn from past mistakes. This means that the plan, do, check, act cycle, fundamental to any competent organization, has been completely abandoned in this military institution. These losses have become a physical reality in the cemetery in Novotroitsk, just outside Moscow. According to reports from War Translated, 6 rows have now been filled in this section, which began in 2022, but the most painful and symbolic detail is that it has become nearly impossible to approach the graves, which have sunk into the sand and clay. Relatives of the interred claim that this area was once a swamp. This serves as one of the most powerful metaphors for Putin's war. Even soldiers killed in battle are denied a dignified final resting place. Their graves are collapsing. Soldiers are buried in the swamp. The narrative of victory and heroism is literally drowning in these collapsing graves across Russia. Putin's allies and his propaganda machine may insist that everything is going according to plan, but these graves and casualty rates whisper the truth to the Russian people. Putin's war has devoured the nation's manpower. The crisis has deepened to such an extent that Russia has commenced recruiting mercenaries from across the globe. According to an Atlantic Council report, large numbers of Nepalese, Indian, Central Asian, and African fighters are being deployed to the Pokrovsk axis. Although most are promised support roles, they too are thrown into the killing machine. Putin's legislative decrees, which provide foreign soldiers with full legal protection and expedited citizenship, make it impossible for these fighters to be prosecuted in their home countries. Russia is thus transforming into a sanctuary for international criminals. This is proof of the lengths to which Putin will go for victory and the extent of his disregard for international law. However, the greatest danger of this war is not those lost on the front lines, but those returning home. Russian economist Igor Lipsitz has warned that the reintegration of war veterans could lead to serious social and economic dislocations. He described these returning soldiers as a social time bomb. During the war, soldiers became accustomed to salaries far exceeding what they could earn in Russia's civilian economy. These veterans will not find comparable employment opportunities in Russia's deteriorating economic landscape. Putin's overheated war economy cannot offer them these wages in peacetime. After spending years in high-intensity conflict, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, will manifest as anger, aggression, and sudden violent outbursts. Anger management issues and the smuggling of small arms are already widespread among the veteran cohort. This is the fuse for a new, silent civil war within Russia. If millions of war-weary, financially dissatisfied, and psychologically traumatized soldiers return home, maintaining social order will become a near impossibility. Moreover, there is already a deficit of 150,000 officers in the Russian police force. Putin can no longer ensure his own internal security. History serves as a warning for Putin. The Soviet Union returned, defeated, from Afghanistan, creating the Afghansy generation, millions of soldiers ostracized by society, unable to find work or receive mental health support. This neglect eroded the people's trust in the Soviet state. Joseph Stalin never wanted soldiers to return home, he preferred them to die. Soldiers returning from World War II were often sent to the Gulag because they had witnessed a better quality of life in Western Europe and returned more self-confident. A dictator does not want an army that knows how to use weapons, is angry, and is dissatisfied within his own country. Putin's current strategy mirrors this dictatorial paranoia. Millions of soldiers are dying in the war and not returning. Those who do return are so physically weak, traumatized, or broken that they cannot offer resistance. The most controversial proposal put forward for veterans was the plan to resettle these soldiers in Siberia. They would be provided with land and financial support to start a new life in the East. Although presented as a reward for service, in reality, it is an attempt to isolate soldiers from the general fabric of Russian society. This plan will feel like exile. You utilized the soldiers, and now you are isolating them. Implementing this plan would increase discontent among the rank and file and lead to major social chaos due to opposition from the local population. Vladimir Putin built his tenure of more than 20 years on 3 pillars: stability, prosperity, and national pride. The grand promise behind his war on Ukraine was that Russia will be great and you will be safe. What we witness today is the complete abrogation of that contract. The war is being lost not by external enemies, but by a wave of internal rebellion. Millions of traumatized and unemployed soldiers returning from the front have become Russia's social powder keg, ready to detonate at any moment. These soldiers will accept neither exile to Siberia nor silence. They are a threat that Putin created with his own hands but can never control. The Kremlin cannot legislate against prisoners escaping, nor prevent disabled soldiers from being sent to the front. They cannot silence the voice of hunger, the whisper of rebellion, or the cry of conscience. The terminus of this war will not be determined by the final bullet fired on the front lines, but by the silent civil war that has begun within Russia itself. Putin is struggling as his own populace awakens to the truth. This could be the final chapter of his political career. So, what is your assessment of this situation? Please share your strategic analysis in the comments. To stay updated on new intelligence briefings, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Thank you for choosing us.